Good evening and welcome to the first St George's House conversation of 2022. It's terrific to have so many of you with us tonight. It's a great pleasure to welcome to our conversation this evening Lord Butler of Brockwell, one of this country's most distinguished public servants and a great friend of St George's House. Lord Butler, as many of you know, has had a career of great distinction, from head of school at Harrow to an outstanding degree at Oxford, including a rugby blue, and then a meteoric rise through the civil service, which he joined in 1961 when Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister. Lord Butler has served 3 Prime Ministers as Private Secretary or Principal Private Secretary: Edward Heath, Harold Wilson and Margaret Thatcher, and was Cabinet Secretary during the premierships of Margaret Thatcher, John Major and Tony Blair. So he really has been at the heart of government during some of the most significant events nationally and internationally in the last 50 years. Even now, he is just back from a debate in the House of Lords. Lord Butler, welcome back to St George's House. A happy new year to you and Lady Butler, and if I may slightly belatedly wish you a happy birthday for a few days ago. It's terrific that you've been able to join us tonight, and I thought I'd start by asking you just about the roles, those 2 roles I mentioned, Private Secretary and Cabinet Secretary, what they involve and how they differ.
Well, Gary, those who watched Yes Minister, and more particularly Yes Prime Minister, it's very easy to identify them. Bernard was the Principal Private Secretary, and Sir Humphrey was the Cabinet Secretary. I unfortunately never had the opportunity to play the role of Jim Hacker, but yes, that's the distinction between the two roles, and I'm sure enough of your audience will be old enough to remember the series.
Yeah, indeed. Now, when you joined the civil service in 1961, there was also in government at that time a man called Robb Butler. So there were 2 R Butlers, which must have led to some confusion.
Well, yes, there is a notable occasion of confusion. When I joined the civil service, I joined the Treasury. And at that time, Robb Butler, he wasn't actually a Treasury Minister, but he had an office in the Treasury. And so when correspondence came in addressed to R. Butler, his office thought it would be better if he had a look at it first. And he saw my correspondence rather than me seeing his. And so instructions were given to that effect. I was at that time playing rugby for Richmond Rugby Club. And I have a card that was inviting me to play against Bath on the following Saturday, which went to Robb's office. And it must have been shown to Robb because he wrote on the top of it, "I'm afraid I'm not available this weekend. Could you please ask Robin Butler if he would take on this task for me?" So it's a nice thing to treasure.
It is a wonderful memento. And looking at the Prime Ministers you served, and knowing as you do that St George's House has a very strong leadership programme, I imagine that every Prime Minister has his or her own particular style. But thinking of leadership, are there shared leadership qualities that go into the making of a good Prime Minister?
Well, the first thing I should say about the Prime Ministers I served was that whatever the media would have you believe, none of them were either rogues or fools. In this country, you don't become Prime Minister without having very great qualities. I'm now outside government, so I'll say that probably even applies to the present Prime Minister. But all of the Prime Ministers I served, I could respect, I liked. They had different qualities, and that was what made them so interesting, really. I mean, our job in 10 Downing Street, which is a house, it's not a department. I mean, there really was a family feeling in it, to help them through all the things that they had to do. And of course, you've certainly, as you'd expect, Harold Wilson, brilliant politician, brilliant leader of the Labour Party, never an easy task. Ted Heath, a man of great integrity, not all that many social skills, but somebody whom you could respect, who had serious intentions for the country. And then Margaret Thatcher, well, what do I need to say about Margaret Thatcher? Definitely knew where she was going, but what was so good about Margaret Thatcher was that as long as she felt that you were doing your best for her, she'd always stand by you. You know, they say whether somebody's a good person to go tiger shooting with. Well, Margaret Thatcher was a good person to go tiger shooting with. And, you know, although I made some mistakes when I was working for her, she was always the first to defend me and comfort me. And then John Major, very different from Margaret Thatcher. I always said the best negotiator of all the prime ministers I worked for, because he had the gift of being able to interpret what the person he was negotiating with really wanted, to see what was the best trade-off between his own objectives and the other person's objectives, and what's more, to communicate that to the person he was negotiating with, that he was trying to get the best for both of them. And this made the people he was dealing with want to agree with him. And then Tony Blair, who of all of them, I think was the best presenter, the best persuader of the public and the House of Commons, of all of them that I worked for. So I felt extremely lucky to see really people of such abilities, but different abilities, at very close hand.
Right. And just thinking of what you said about Tony Blair as being the best presenter of them all, was that the moment when the office of Prime Minister became more about presentation and publicity than policy?
Well, it changed throughout, really. But yes, I mean, that was a very big turning point, not because of his personality, but because the way the world changed. You know, we were moving into 24/7 media and social media and very 24/7 press. So that all the time you were dealing with a story. I mean, very often the media and the public had short attention spans, but you know, there were fires and you had to put them out quickly. So a very quick reaction was needed. I remember, you know, that when New Labour came in 1997, their main criticism of the civil service was that press offices and departments were very ponderous in dealing with the press. They would be lampooning it to say, you know, it was 9 to 5, and then if a journalist rang up after that, they couldn't get any reply. I mean, that wasn't true, but they were slower in reacting, whereas New Labour in opposition had developed a very, very quick reaction technique. Now, actually, in some cases, it turned out to be too quick, and they made mistakes from reacting too quickly to the media and then regretting it. But that was the way the world had gone. And of course, the other thing, I mean, is just to say, I mean, we talk about, you know, political appointees now, SPAD, special advisors. Civil servants are more interested and more skilled at policy and what I would call government. SPADs are skilled at politics and presentation. And I think it would be true to say, you know, although I'm now sort of an old man saying it, and one always thinks that things have changed since one's own day, that the emphasis has swung towards the latter from the former. And so it is, I think, a bit more difficult for civil servants to get a hearing. and politicians look first to their special advisor. Gary, I'm having a cup of tea. Can I have that while we talk?
You can, of course. Absolutely. Of course. I'm delighted to see that you're wearing your St. George's House tie.
And you see that I'm also wearing I've got a Brockwell Park mug.
Oh, that's good. We're both South London boys. Even better. Even better. Now, I wouldn't be so crass as to ask you which of the prime ministers you worked with was the best. But when Mrs. Thatcher resigned, you held a small gathering of people who had worked closely with her.
Yes.
And I think you said at that gathering that the thing that will be most interesting about us in later years is that we worked with Margaret Thatcher. Do you still think that? And if so, why?
Well, I know it because my grandchildren, who on the whole don't take as much interest in my career as I would like them to, and as you're kindly doing, the one thing they do ask all the time is, what was Margaret Thatcher like? And that's what people do tend to ask you. Yes, you may remember the traumatic circumstances in which she left Number 10. I had a little reception drinks party in my room in the Cabinet Office next door that evening, and she and Dennis came back. I made this little speech, and you know that sometimes you say things, you often say things you regret, but sometimes you say things that you're glad you said. And I did say that when our grandchildren ask us what we did, what they will be most interested in is that we worked with Margaret Thatcher. That was meant as a compliment to her, but it's turned out to be true.
Of course, of course. And just sticking with Mrs. Thatcher for the moment, you were in the room in the Grand Hotel in Brighton on the night that the bomb exploded. I think that would be very interesting for our audience to hear about.
Yes, well, a never to be forgotten night, and of course a sad night because people lost their lives. But the story of it is that when Margaret Thatcher was preparing a speech for her party conference, which was an absolutely ghastly experience because she worked long into the night. And on this occasion, she finished the speech rather early by her standards, at about 2:30 in the morning. I was there, I was at Brighton, because although it was a political occasion, of course, there was always work coming through from Number 10. And there was a particular document on which Number 10 wanted a decision from her by the opening of the office next morning. And so the speechwriters and the advisors left. And I gave her this document and said, could you look at this overnight and let me know at breakfast, what you want done about it? And she said, well, if you don't mind, I'll deal with it now, because then I can forget about it and I can concentrate on the speech. So she was sitting in an armchair. I was sitting in an armchair opposite. She was going through the document. I've still got the document with her pen lines on it up to the point where the bomb went off. And I was sitting in my armchair thinking, oh gosh, I'll be in bed in 10 minutes time. And then there was this great explosion. And the extraordinary thing was the lights didn't go off. But I came to and thought, now, Butler, here you are alone with the Prime Minister and somebody's trying to blow her up. You better do something sensible. And the only sensible thing I could think of was to say, come away from the windows because there may be another explosion. And she said, and I shall never forget this, I must see if Dennis is all right. And so she went across the room, door to the bedroom, opened the door to the bedroom, and it was in darkness because Dennis had gone to bed. And you could hear through the door the noise of falling masonry, which actually was the bathroom, her bathroom. And what I should have said was, stand back, Prime Minister. I think this is a job for somebody a bit more dispensable than you. But not wishing to stand between a lady in her bedroom, I let her go in and stayed outside wondering what I was going to say to the Tribunal of Inquiry. Anyway, she came out a few seconds later with Dennis pulling grey trousers over his pyjamas. And we went out into the corridor, looked up the corridor. As I say, the lights were still on. And we could see from the next room along, there was what looked like smoke coming out. And it was Geoffrey Howe's suite, and his protection officer was jumping at the door, trying to kick it in. And so I assumed that that's where the bomb must have gone off. Actually, I mean, it was fortunate that the protection officer didn't succeed in kicking the door down, because if he had, he'd have gone straight through into nothingness. But then the following door, the door beyond that, opened, and Geoffrey Howe came out in his pajamas and came blinking down the corridor. And so there the three of us were. And the next thing that happened was a fireman appeared. The response was very impressively rapid. And he said, follow me. So the three of us followed him down the corridor, which turned out to be a cul-de-sac. So he said, follow me back. And then we got to the staircase, which, as I say, was in light. We went down. The building had collapsed and the foyer had collapsed. And so Margaret Thatcher broke off to go and see if the people on the desk, the foyer lobby desk, were okay, which they were. And then we were taken out of the back. And at that point, I thought to myself, well, all the number 10 papers are lying about upstairs. All our clothes are still there. Not knowing that the hotel was hanging by a thread over my head. One of the protection officers and I went up, and we packed the papers, and we packed her clothes and Dennis's clothes and my clothes, and went down, and were then taken. I mean, she'd gone on, but we were taken on to Hove Police Station, where everybody was being assembled. And then we went to Lewes Police Training College. As I say, you know, the contingency plans were excellent. There was a room for her, and there was a room for me, but I gave my room to Dennis, and I kept down in the day room of the college, where there was a television and a telephone. The telephone rang, and it was John Gummer saying, I'm afraid it's much worse than we thought. They've already found some people on the top floor, the McLeans, dead, and they're digging for John Wakeham and Norman Tebbit. And he said, the television's now here, and if you turn it on, you can see what's happening. And I thought to myself, shall I go and wake Margaret Thatcher and tell her this? And then I thought, no, I mean, let her get some sleep. So I turned on the television, saw Norman Tebbit being brought out, obviously very badly injured. John Wakeham, they were still trying to bring out. And at 8 o'clock, Margaret Thatcher and Dennis appeared, very smartly dressed in the clothes that we'd rescued. And I told her that things were worse than we'd thought, and that there were fatalities. And this, again, I'll never forget. She said, well, it's 8 o'clock. Conference is due to start at 9:30, and it must start on time. And I couldn't believe it. I said to her, you can't be serious. There's been this terrible thing happened, and you know, some of your closest colleagues have been killed and others injured. You can't be going on with a party political conference. And she said, this is our opportunity to show that terrorism can't defeat democracy. And there she was on the platform at 9:30. It brings a lump to my throat even to think of it, really. And then during that morning, Ronnie Miller, who was her speechwriter, and I rewrote her speech at the party conference, taking out all the jokes. And Ronnie wrote a bit at the beginning. And at 11 o'clock, the Bishop of Arundel and the Bishop of Lewes arrived, and we had a little prayer meeting in the private secretary's room in the conference centre. And at 12 o'clock, my wife rang and told me that our middle daughter had got into Oxford. And I thought to myself, if the chimney had fallen down the other way, I would never have known.
Right.
And then anyway, she made her conference speech. We drove back to London. I drove home. And I kid you not, I thought my wife would throw her arms around my neck and say, "Oh, darling, thank goodness, I'm so anxious, so glad you've survived." What she actually said was, "Well, that'll teach you for sitting up with a blonde at 10 to 3 in the morning."
It's such a wonderful story. Of course, shrouded in sadness, but
yeah,
a very interesting time.
But I think,
yep.
What I feel about her, it was one of those moments when you saw a politician preparing absolutely instinctively for something that they couldn't possibly have foreseen.
Of course.
And that thing about, must see if my husband's all right, and we've got to go on with the conference and show that the terrorists have lost. Very striking moments.
Of course. Now, as Cabinet Secretary, what and this is a question which has come in from John Heritage, what was your biggest leadership challenge, and why was it so?
Well, I was head of the civil service. I mean, that was really the sort of main, that was associated with being Cabinet Secretary, and it doesn't have to be associated with it, but it was, and it's a good idea because as Cabinet Secretary, you have a lot of access to the Prime Minister for decisions that have got to be taken about the civil service. So it was to, I think, give a lead to a civil service which was then 500,000 people. We had various projects that the government had. Margaret Thatcher, she was always after greater efficiency. She'd set targets for reducing the size of the civil service, and so that had to be brought off. There was an initiative called the Next Steps Initiative, which was to set up the executive operations of the civil service under somebody who was a manager, not a permanent secretary. So you were separating, the things that you perform for the public from advice to ministers about policy. And so we did that, and I think we did improve the standard of a lot of the services that faced the public. But it was to lead a team, and it really rather prepared me. I was subsequently head of my college at Oxford. The permanent secretaries of the departments, the head civil servants of the departments, were not people I could boss about. I mean, they were principally responsible for their ministers, but I did have a bit of leverage over their careers for what they were next appointed to. So, they did try to keep on the right side of me. But, in general, we tried to work as a family in support of the government, because, that is, whichever government it is, whichever party it is, that's the tradition of the civil service.
Yes, of course. And is it difficult as a civil servant, with presumably your own political views, to be apolitical?
Well, I think it depends on your character, really. When I talk to people from school or university who are contemplating the civil service, I say, it's not a bad thing to be interested in politics, because politics is what government is all about. But if you feel that you could only work for one of the two, or I should say 3 main parties in the country, and you couldn't work for the others, well, then that's an indication you ought to be a politician rather than a civil servant. I think the best comparison of the job is with a barrister. A barrister has to do their best for whoever their client is. Similarly, the civil service has to do its best for whatever government the country has created. But it can produce some traumatic personal moments, as you can imagine, because one week you're sitting next to one prime minister with whom you've become very close and very friendly, and then the next week if the electorate so decide, you're doing the same thing for the person who's always been that Prime Minister's political appointment. Now, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition are sophisticated people. They know that you've got to do that. But when you've formed a close personal relationship and you've lived through, particular crises, it can be difficult. Have I got time? I mean, there's a nice story about when Tony Blair arrived, and again, a lot of people will remember that, all the crowds in Downing Street and people wearing flags and so on. And he came into Downing Street, and the tradition is that the principal private secretary welcomes him, and he walks down the corridor to the cabinet room. The cabinet secretary stands outside the cabinet room and welcomes him. And the Downing Street staff line the corridor and clap. And as Tony Blair was coming down, he noticed one girl had tears pouring down her cheeks. And so he stopped and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, are you okay?" And she said, yes. She said, "You're very welcome, but I did so like that nice Mr. Major."
I hope Mr. Blair didn't sack her on the spot.
Not at all. No, absolutely not.
And interestingly, I was just about to ask you about that transition from John Major's government to Tony Blair's government. And did you feel that the country was ready for a change at that point? Yes,
I certainly did. And I thought it was pretty obvious that it was going to happen. I remember, as we were preparing for it, because what happens during the election campaign, what the civil servants are doing is preparing for whatever government comes in. And so, whoever arrives, you've got to make sure that you can help them to hit the ground running. And I remember having a meeting of the Cabinet Office in the Central Methodist Hall and saying to them, the challenge for us, for you, is not if Labour win, because we've all been sort of working and preparing for that. The challenge will be if the Conservatives win again, and we've got to show them that we're as eager and keen and professional as we always have been. So yes, I mean, the excitement, of course, the transition is exciting.
Yeah, of course.
The excitement was a change of governments, and what we'd have had to really sort of brace ourselves for was the same government coming back.
Right, and of course you successfully oversaw that transition, and then you retired, and you and Jill were in Mexico when a very particular phone call came, and perhaps you tell us about that.
Yes, well, when I retired, I'd been elected master of my old college at Oxford, University College, and that was very nice. But I was also put on the board of HSBC, the bank, and they had a meeting in Mexico. And I was raising money. I was chair of the fundraising committee to raise money for the Cabinet War Rooms and for the Churchill museum there. And for that, I wanted to go and see George Bush Sr.'s museum. That was, I couldn't get to that immediately. So I had to occupy the Monday doing something else. And we went to see a site called Teotihuacan, north of Mexico. As we were coming back in the car, we had a driver, and the driver's mobile rang, and she answered it and looked a bit puzzled and said, "I think this must be for you. It's 10 Downing Street." So I took it, and it was Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's chief of staff. And he said, "Robin, your country needs you again." And I could guess what it was, because George Bush in America had set up a committee to try and investigate why, when the whole basis of going to war in Iraq had been weapons of mass destruction, none had been found. And so he'd set up an inquiry, and it was pretty obvious that the British government would have to set up an inquiry. And so just at the moment when Jonathan was about to put this proposition to me, of course, the line cut out. And my wife said, "Don't touch it with a barge pole, it's a poisoned chalice." But actually partly through vanity, but partly through the fact that it was a real puzzle why it was the intelligence services had been so wrong that I couldn't resist doing it. And so then I chaired this, what became known as the Butler Review of Intelligence on Weapons of Mass Destruction.
Yes. And did you ever regret not listening to Lady Butler's advice?
No, I didn't. Because it was a fascinating job to do. And of course, I got great cooperation from the intelligence services because they were both embarrassed, but also fascinated by how it was. You know, they had in good faith been convinced that Saddam Hussein had biological and chemical weapons and was trying to get a nuclear weapon, as indeed had the intelligence services of other countries around the world. I mean, it wasn't just the British that had reached that conclusion. And so, you know, they were fascinated about why it had gone so wrong, and keep very keen to learn the lessons that they could learn from this terrible episode.
I suppose, I mean, it is fair to say that was pretty much an international intelligence fiasco, wasn't it?
It was. It was. And, you know, there were good reasons for it, because Saddam Hussein had chemical and biological weapons. He'd used it on people who were the Marsh Arabs. It turned out subsequently, when he was caught and eventually interrogated, which was long after I'd done my review, that he was asked, you know, well, did you have this stuff? And he said, no, I didn't have it, but I would have got it again, and I'd have got a nuclear weapon if I could, once I'd got the UN sanctions taken off. So it wasn't that he, you know, suddenly seen the light and wasn't interested in having these weapons anymore.
But, Lord Butler, just going back to the business of the cabinet and cabinet government, do you think that has changed during your lifetime, for better or worse?
Yes, it has changed. I mean, you know, from the way that I explained, I think how politics and government has changed. It's much more concerned with the political stories of the moment. It changed particularly, actually, when New Labour came in, because New Labour was really a sort of cell, a revolutionary cell within the Labour Party. I mean, you could say within the cabinet that it was Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Peter Mandelson and John Prescott, a link to the members of the cabinet who were old Labour. So Tony Blair was not particularly keen on, you know, having every sort of issue put up for discussion, and because I thought he wouldn't naturally get a majority. Now, actually, a lot of prime ministers are in this position. I always said of Margaret Thatcher that if she had a difficult thing to get across, she'd get one person she knew agreed with her, and they would call another person in, and they would persuade that person to agree with them, and then the three of them would call in two other people until she got a majority. You know, she was sure she would get a majority when it came to the full cabinet discussion. So during and I mean, there's no secret about this. I mean, it's been published. During the 9 months in which I was cabinet secretary to the incoming Labour government and Tony Blair was prime minister, there was the only decision that was ever actually genuinely taken by the cabinet was to have the Millennium Dome. You know, everything else was taken by a smaller group with Tony Blair chairing them, and the Labour Party were told what had been the cabinet were told what had been decided. And so there was always, I think, you know, in that government particularly, decisions made and then sold to the sold to the cabinet, including, eventually what was decided about going to war in Iraq, though that was after my time. But I firmly believe in the cabinet government if we could make it work properly, for this reason, that when you've got an issue coming up, you may think that it's just an issue for the Home Office or the Treasury, and then you find that it affects some other part of the government in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have realised, Scotland or Wales or hospitals or something like that. And so a decision's best taken if you have the Secretaries of State for all the Secretaries of State round who can put their hand up and say, oh, wait a minute, if we do this, there'll be this consequence or that consequence. And so the way that you think of all the things that might go wrong is to have everybody involved. But the other thing, I think, is that you do want people to, the other members of the cabinet, who are big political figures, to also to feel they own the decisions and they've had their opportunity to contribute. If you don't have that and they go wrong, you then, people either publicly or privately say, well, it wasn't me, Gav, I wouldn't have done it.
And reading your biography, you had to deal off and on with quite a bit of sleaze as cabinet secretary. It kind of ebbed and flowed. And do you sense from the sidelines now that we're headed once again in that direction?
Yes, I mean, it's a consequence of investigative media. It's a very good thing, a free press, because it stops politicians getting away with things. And of course, again, I mean, because of the way the media have gone, and also, I mean, the age of, when I joined the civil service, I think you could still say we were in the age of deference. And it was coming to an end because there was a famous television program that only the oldest people watching this webinar will remember, called That Was the Week That Was, when people started making fun of politicians. I always remember my father, who was a very respectful man, being really shocked when the Times newspaper, instead of calling the Prime Minister Mr. Heath or Mr. Wilson, called them Heath or Wilson. Anyway, the age of deference had gone. And so the press were on the lookout for scandals, and scandals sell newspapers. I was sometimes asked to investigate these things. It wasn't actually one of the things that I did best. But sometimes, if the evidence of something that had gone wrong was inside the government papers, it was sensible for the head of the civil service to investigate it. No doubt the reason why my successor, Simon Case, is being asked to investigate these parties, or was asked to investigate the so-called Christmas parties. But if it's something that might involve criminality, then the police ought to investigate it. So you need horses for courses. Yeah.
Good. And a question that from one of our other listeners asks, do you feel that the civil service is treated as less important by this government than previous governments? And if it is, what should it do to rectify that, or what can it do?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think because of the way that politics and political world has changed, politicians are a bit more inclined to give attention to their political advisors rather than their civil service advisors. But they depend on the civil service and on the public services for things happening. And so, when you think of COVID, and of the things that did go well, rather than the things that didn't go well. You can always point to things that didn't go well. But, the thing that did go well was the organisation of the administration of the vaccine. Now, that owed a lot to Kate Bingham, who identified, which vaccines to invest in. But the job of actually distributing that around the country, and getting to the places where it was needed and the quantities that it was needed, and organising ways it could be put into arms. All that was done by the National Health Service and the Civil Service. I often reflected on when the task force was sent to the Falklands. The amount of organisation which is involved in arranging something like that is huge. And that's the sort of job that the civil service, also, of course, the military, do. And people sort of, tend to forget about, and they blame the civil servants. They think they just sit at their desks and shuffle paper. Well, no, I mean, they don't. There are very big operations that have to be managed.
And of course, I mean, we've concentrated mainly on your work within the UK, but you were a serious participant on the international stage as well, and meeting various foreign leaders, one thing and another. And Douglas Wren has come in with a question. What is your perception of the state of democracy at present, and perhaps particularly in the United States?
Well, again, I think this is a worldwide phenomenon. I think we've got into and I think the easiest thing to attribute it to is social media. We've got into rather a worrying demagogic atmosphere in politics, because people can communicate with each other. If they want to demonstrate, they can mobilize each other very quickly. And so what goes through the social media is, I think by definition, it's the people. Now, you may say this is a good thing, that there is much wider participation, but wider participation, as I was a classicist, the ancient Athenians discovered, doesn't always lead to the best decisions. And so I think we are in danger of getting demagogic leaders who rely on the mob for their support, rather than choosing people who, as our system is, electing people to represent you, rather than to just follow you. Margaret Thatcher always used to say, she used to speak with great scorn of people who said, "I am their leader, therefore I must follow them." She said, "That's not what I'm going to do."
So we live in interesting, if dangerous times. But just thinking about the interesting, the powerful, the famous people you've met over your lifetime, who has stood out?
Well, you think this is just a sort of diplomatic answer, but so many people have stood out. As I say, I was proud of working in our government, whichever parties I worked for. On the whole, I thought we were very lucky in the people that we had in public life. And, there were very few who, in fact, I can hardly think of any, who I would say were just fools or rogues.
Yeah. And on the international stage?
Well,
I think you were very You were very fond of Nelson Mandela.
I was very well. Who wouldn't be? And it was a great honour to meet him. I liked and admired Ronald Reagan. I liked, I had the pleasure of meeting him. I liked and admired George Bush Senior. I was impressed by Francois Mitterrand. I didn't actually get the opportunity really to get to know Mr. Gorbachev. He was just coming on the scene when I was coming up to leaving Downing Street, but I admired what I saw of him. So many really.
Great.
I just feel very lucky.
we're coming very close to the end of our time, but I just wanted to ask you one last question, if I might. And this really comes from reading the biography. And you mentioned your father earlier on. You're a very competitive man and have been throughout your life, right up to those mathematics A levels with Jill. And much of it seems to me to be about wanting to honor your father. Is that right?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I was brought up in a games environment. He was a great rugby player. I mean, a better rugby player than I was. He didn't get an England cap, but he should have done. Played for England against the rest. He brought me up. When I was a small boy, he took me off to Twickenham and he took me off to Lords, and he invested an awful lot of time in me, and we played golf against each other and I never beat him. So yes, I mean, competitive games have been an important part of my life, and I think I put in who's who, what my interests are. I think I put competitive games, and I think games are fun. And I've brought up my children to enjoy games. And I think you learn a lot from them. I mean, you learn as much from losing as you do from winning. So no, I wouldn't say, I would say my father was a great influence, but I wouldn't say that it was solely because of him that I became competitive.
Okay, well, how nice to finish on a personal note like that after such a public career. It just remains for me, Lord Butler, to say what a privilege it has been and a pleasure to talk to you this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, Gary, thank you. I mean, it's a terrible thing for old men who enjoy talking about themselves, but it's a pleasure. But I very much valued my association with St. George's House. I've been to some great conferences there in the past. Now, obviously, being in the Garter, that brings me to Windsor, and it's one of the proudest associations of my life. So it's very nice to be able to do something that you asked me to do.
That's great, thank you. And I hope it won't be too long before we see you in Windsor again in person. But for now, it just remains for me to thank our audience for joining us this evening. A happy new year to each and every one of you, and keep safe, keep well, and good night.